I'm more than happy to actually be here, thinking science, thinking faith. At last, Adrian and I started thinking about this between 3 and 4 years ago. And thanks to a slight disease which came about, postponement was the main name of the game. So here we are at last, more than happy to actually introduce Richard Baker, Dr. Richard Baker, for two reasons. One, he's obviously a perpetual student because he's now doing an MSc, which he'll tell us about a little possibly, in sustainability. But for me, one of the reasons I'm excited to have him is that he's a leading light at Bramall Methodist Church in Stockport and has given many talks on climate change and progressive Christianity. And I think that's exactly what we're here for. Basically, Richard's going to do two short presentations, one on climate change and one on theological reflections. We will then break out in some breakout rooms, and right at the end, a very, very brief feedback to end the session. Okay, so I hand over to Richard to introduce Thinking Science, Thinking Faith, Climate Change and Progressive Christianity. Richard.
So thanks for the introduction, Martin. I'm Richard Baker. I've actually left Bramall Methodist Church, but I'll come to that in a moment. I'm speaking from a slightly different perspective to the one you might normally get, in that I'm not actually a formal expert in the field of climate change. So I'll just tell you a little bit about my story. Until about 5 years ago, I was a professor in health sciences at Salford University. I've got a physics degree and a later training in biomechanical engineering. So I've had a solid research and academic background in science in a different discipline in an earlier part of my life. About 5 years ago, I got a bit of push and pull. I got extremely frustrated with academic life and the subject I was working in, but I also felt a call to do something more orientated towards my faith. So I took on a role as lay pastor at Bramall Methodist Church, as Martin was saying. In the lead up to the COP meeting last year, we put on what we called a climate year, which I led, which had quite a range of different activities. I led some small group discussion activities about the climate. We put on a series of webinars asking scientists who were involved in the climate and environmental spheres who were also Christians to talk about the relationship between their science and their faith. We even put on a climate themed flower festival towards the end of the year. So we had a range of different activities. Towards the end of that year, I got more and more motivated to work within the sphere, but the church itself had had enough of the subject, so I decided to just leave them where they are to get on with a different agenda, the one they needed to, and have spent the year since doing a variety of small projects, some paid and some voluntary, around the idea of Christianity and the climate emergency. One of the things I've worked on is a module for the Methodist Local Preacher Development Program on how to preach biblically about climate change. And some of the ideas in that module are going to be informing the talk I'm giving tonight. I got to the end of that year and decided I actually needed to formalize my understanding of climate-related matters a little bit more. So I'm now, as Martin said, I've now registered for a master's degree, which I'm doing at the Centre for Alternative Technology in Machynlleth in Wales. And that's basically sustainability and behavioural change. From my work in the church, it's quite obvious that the big issue isn't telling people about climate change or knowing what to do. It's trying to work out how to change those behaviours. So that's what I've chosen to study. So that's a little bit of my background, why I'm speaking on this subject this evening. If anybody wants to contact me, I'm richard@largeblue.co.uk, and I have a blog about faith and climate matters at www.largeblue.co.uk. And I'll finish off my talk with a little reference to why it's called Large Blue. So the big question I want to look at tonight is what does progressive Christianity have to say about the climate emergency? And I'd particularly like to explore what it is that progressive Christianity has to say about the climate emergency that is different to what the mainstream church is telling us. What is it that we can contribute to the debate within the church about how we should engage with this topic? And I thought I might start off with the 8 points of progressive Christianity. And number 1 is seek God, however understood, guided by the life and teachings of Jesus, which in the context of this present topic really posed me to ask, what do the life and teaching of Jesus have to say about the climate emergency? And I want to proffer the fairly simple answer that I don't think that the life and teaching of Jesus have anything directly to say about the climate emergency. Jesus lived 2,000 years ago. He lived in a world where it was absolutely inconceivable that mankind would be in a position to destroy the planet in the way we're doing at the moment. Inconceivable that we could control the environment in which the way we're doing it. And as a consequence, I don't think there's anything direct that we can look to in the life and teachings of Jesus and say that this is what he's saying about the climate emergency. So I think we need to have a different approach. And the approach I adopt is that there are a range of different themes that emerge from Jesus's teachings, and having identified those themes, we can then see how those apply to the present situation. And I think you'll see as we move through some of these what it is that I mean. So the first theme that I think emerges from Jesus's teaching is a reverence for the truth. And I think this is something that's really at the heart of progressive Christianity. Because I think progressive Christianity is adding 2 things to mainstream Christianity in this level. First of all, we have to add into our theology what we've learned over the last 2,000 years. And that includes the revelations through science, particularly over the last 150 years or so. And I think as progressive Christians, we are very willing to draw that into our theological understanding of what's going on in the world. And the other thing I think that progressive Christianity brings is it looks back and actually looks at what the Bible actually says. Things like the historical Jesus movement and movements like that are actually re-examining what the Bible actually says, rather than assuming that what the mainstream church tells us the Bible says is true. So we're going to look today at bringing in scientific understanding to our theology, and also a little bit of reflecting on what the Bible actually says, rather perhaps than what the mainstream church tells us it says. So I'm going to start off with probably about 10 to 12 minutes now talking about what the scientific consensus is on climate change at the moment. I'm helped in this by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. They're a body that was established in 1988 by the United Nations when it became appreciated that the climate was changing, to try and document what the scientific consensus was. And over that last, nearly 25 years, they've pulled out 5 previous reports on the state of the climate, roughly 5 or 6 year intervals. In 2007, they were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And I think it's important there that it's the Peace Prize they won, not the prize for science. They've won the prize for peace because of the contribution they're making to societal progress in the area. Over the last year, the 6th annual summary reports have been published. So 3 of these have been published so far. This is the first one, which is on the physical science of the basis of where science is at. There are 2 more reports I'll talk about. And at the moment, there is haggling about the summer report that pulls it all together. Basically, the scientists want to say one thing and the politicians want to say something else. It was supposed to be published in September, and it's now been delayed till February. So we'll have to wait for that to come out. But I'm going to go through a little bit what the already published components are telling us. I think before I do that, I just want to say a little bit about the scope of this work. 234 experts were on the editorial board for this particular volume. This is just 1/3 of the work, the first volume. Together, they reviewed over 14,000 scientific papers, and they accepted 78,000 comments from interested parties on what they're doing. So this is a considerable body of work that's being reported here. The other thing to say is, I hope I don't have to convince too many people in our audience, but whatever some of the press will tell you, there is overwhelming consensus among scientists on the primary findings of the reports. There's lots of debate about the details, but on the overall findings of the report, there is nearly 100% agreements on scientists. And these 3 green bars here show you 3 studies that have been done over the last 5 or 6 years that looked at the scientific papers that have been published over that period and counted how many of them essentially agreed with the mainstream view and how many disagreed. And you can see that all of them are over 97%, and the most recent ones are much higher than that. So as far as science has agreement on what is true, these 3 reports convey that in relation to climate change. So what do they say? Well, the basic facts are that if you look at this graph over time, from 1500 to 2100, those are the years, until about 1900, the global surface of the temperature stayed constant at a fixed value. Over the 120 years since then, the temperature of the planet, the average temperature over the whole of the planet has risen. And it's risen by an amount that, if we take that back to the axis, is about 1.1 degrees. So the world's temperature now is about 1.1 degrees hotter than it was 120 years ago, or even further back. And that's the fundamental finding of climate change, that yes, our planet is getting warmer. Now, if you plot on the same graph, but on different axes, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in this blue line, some of you might be having difficulty seeing the blue line. That's because it's lying on top of the black line. There is an exact correspondence between the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the amount of warming that we're having, the amount of the temperature of the planet. And that is conclusive proof that it is actually the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that is driving our warming of the planet. And of course, that carbon dioxide is coming from burning fossil fuels. And the reason that both the carbon dioxide and the temperature started to rise about 1900 was a consequence of the Industrial Revolution, when we started burning fossil fuels across the world. The IPCC reports, for the last 3 reports, have all included this sentence: it's unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and the land. There is absolutely no doubt, as far as scientists are concerned, that this is what has happened. Now, one of the problems with climate change debate is that 1.1 degrees doesn't sound very much. And I think many scientists now think that actually using this single statistic was perhaps a mistake, because it is quite easy to dismiss. Most people, perhaps those living in Manchester like me, might quite like to be 1.1 degrees hotter throughout the year. What you've got to take into account, though, is that this is really a measure that summarizes the overall heating, and the actual amount, the 1.1 degrees, isn't all that important, because it's not actually the average rise that's important. It's the fluctuations that come with it that are a lot more important. And this average tends to hide those, because it's an average across the whole of the planet, across the whole of the year, and across a number of different environments within the planet. So you have to think about not so much 1.1 degrees, a small number, but you have to think 1.1 degree, what sort of effects does that have? So the sort of effects we're already having are the flooding that we've seen earlier the year in Pakistan. And there's now a group, a developing part of climate science is called attribution studies. So in an attribution study, the researchers try and work out how much more likely a particular event has been as a consequence of the warming we've already had. So you can see that in the flooding in Pakistan, the rainfall is 50% greater as a result of global warming. So the fact that the floods are as high as they are is a consequence of global warming. On the other hand, we've got, that was an extreme of rainfall. We've also got extremes of drought. So there is currently a drought in East Africa. So historically, East Africa had droughts every 7 or 8 years. That meant in between droughts, there was 6 or 7 years in which the farmers could recover and could prepare for the next drought. The World Meteorological Office is now forecasting the 5th successive rainy season without rain. And I think some of you on your television sets last night might have seen some of the devastating pictures from Somalia at the moment, which is largely a consequence of this drought. So that, again, is now being seen as a direct consequence of global warming. Tropical storms are getting not necessarily more frequent, but they are getting worse and worse. So Hurricane Maria, which hit the northeastern Caribbean in 2017, was the worst hurricane in 59 years. I think that's during when records been recorded, and it contained 30% more rain than the previous worst hurricane. The changes are quite startling. And the final example I want to give you here is of the US heat dome, which hit the northwestern United States in 2021 in the early summer. This graph you've got here, this bar chart, is from the Coroner's Service in British Columbia. It showed that in late June, there were 526 deaths in a particular week. And throughout the rest of the year, there are hardly any heat-related deaths in British Columbia. The World Weather Attribution Center have looked at it and have come to the conclusion that that heat dome would have been virtually impossible with global warming. It's not a matter of being 20% or 30% more likely. It would have been virtually impossible without the global warming that we're seeing at the moment. So I think you'll have seen that those examples show us that 1.1 degrees of warming is something that we need to worry about. The IPCC isn't just interested in what's happening in the past and what's happening in the present, though. It's also interested in what's happening in the future. And to describe that, it comes up with 5 scenarios. Because if the IPCC doesn't know how world governments are going to act, it can't predict exactly how temperatures are going to rise. So it's given us 5 different scenarios. The first scenario is the worst scenario. And under those circumstances, this is the scenario that would happen if world consensus broke down and we actually started having wars that were relating to the climate emergency. It also requires that the scientists' worst estimates, because everything's an estimate at the moment, that their worst estimates come true. If that happens, then by 2100, we will have reached very nearly 5 degrees centigrade of global warming. That's over 4 times as much warming as we've already had. And the other thing you'll note is it's not stopping in 2100. It's going up almost exponentially after that. The next scenario is one where there isn't actually complete breakdown of world order, but in which countries start competing with each other for resources rather than collaborating on solutions. And in that under those circumstances, the temperature will rise to about 3.9 degrees by 2100. And as you can see, also, it is a continuing rise after that. And the final projection I want to talk about immediately is one that is basically where the IPCC feel will be if we follow current trends. So current trends really are governments making some quite dramatic proposals about what they're going to do, but not actually delivering on those commitments. It's not only countries, it's local governments, it's also big corporations. A lot of people are starting to talk about climate change, but there's a lot less action than there is talk. And if these things continue to go ahead, we'll end up with 2.7 degrees warming in 2100. And again, it will be going up a little bit less steeply at the time, but there will still be continued rises after that. The reports try and give us some feeling for what those larger rises in temperature are going to be. So the first one is they talk about heat waves. So one of the examples they give, if you can imagine the hottest year that you can remember, the hottest year in the last 50 years. So I think I saw from beforehand that most of us are over 50, but if you think of the hottest year in your memory, if temperatures go up to 2 degrees C, then 30 years out of every 50, that's 1 in 4 years will be as hot as the hottest year you can remember. And if we allow temperatures to get up to 4 degrees C, then 39 years in 50, that's nearly 4 years out of every 5 years will be as hot as the hottest year you can remember. We can look at terms in terms of water security. And particularly we've seen over the summer that we had the northern Italy was particularly hit by water scarcity with the Po River drying up. Well, if we get to 2 degrees centigrade of global warming, then 33%, a third of the population of Southern Europe, are going to be at risk. They're exposed to water scarcity to the extent that it will be difficult for big populations to live in the cities there. If we got up to 3 degrees of global warming, then 2/3 of Southern Europe is going to be exposed to the same level of water scarcity. If we look at drought within sub-Saharan Africa, if the temperatures go up to 1.7 degrees, remember they're 1.1 degrees at the moment, we will see between 17 and 40 million internal migrants. And I think those of us who are watching the news over the last few days will have already seen some of that internal migration, internal displacement happening in East Africa at the moment. If we were to let that to get up to 2.5 degrees, between 56 and 86 million people would be displaced. They are huge numbers we're talking about. I think this is my final slide on this little bit, but if we talk about coral reefs, if we let the temperature go up by an extra 0.4 degrees, that's not very much, then there's going to be 70 to 90% loss of coral reefs. And if we let it get up to 2 degrees, then 99% of the world's coral, this is tropical coral, the pretty coral that has all the fishes, 99% of that will be lost if we allow temperatures to go up to 2 degrees C. So you can see that whichever of these three futures eventuate, we're going to be in for some pretty dramatic changes as a consequence of those temperature rises. But there is some good news as well. And the good news is that there are 2 other scenarios that I haven't talked about. So the first one is what the IPCC talk about concerted action. So if we get governments working together as they are doing at the moment and making the same promises that they're giving at the moment, but actually delivering on those promises, then we will find that the temperature maximizes at about 1.8 degrees in the middle of the century and actually starts to drop a little bit after that. That means that not only is the temperature rise at 2100 limited to 1.7 degrees, but actually it's starting to drop after that. And the final scenario is that if we actually honor the agreements of the Paris Agreement, it's 2017, I think, to get to net zero by 2050, then we could well actually have the temperatures around about 1.4 degrees at the end of the century and continuing to fall after that. The trouble with this one is that most scientists are in agreement that it's going to be almost impossible to meet the terms of the Paris Agreement now. So the 1.7 degrees of temperature rise is probably the best that we can hope for. So the final, well, not the final, the third volume of the report, which was published in August, I think it was, is one on how we can mitigate climate change. What is it that we can do about it? So we can, as you've seen, we can limit climate change. We can't get rid of it entirely, but we can limit it. It's going to require several things. The first thing, it's going to require us all to reduce the amount of energy we use. And that's going to happen for individuals, but also for industries and governments as well. It's going to require the energy we do still need to use to come from renewable energy sources. The projections of the IPCC assume that carbon capture is going to start occurring on a massive scale. And the biggest single criticism of the IPCC as a body is that carbon capture technology doesn't actually exist at the moment. So a lot of people think that the IPCC forecasts are overly positive as a consequence of that. And the I think this is the final point on this slide, is that the lead will have to come from high-income countries. It's high-income countries that are causing the problem, and the lead is going to have to come from them to try and sort it out. And yes, the fifth point is that these changes have to happen immediately. There is an urgency about this that requires us to start bringing our carbon emissions under control, start reduce them as quickly as possible. And we're too late already, basically. This doesn't require us to go back and start living in the caves. Various organizations have looked at what zero carbon Britain would look like. And one particular vision I'd recommend to you is from the Centre for Alternative Technology, where I'm doing my master's degree, where there's been a 5-year study to look at what a zero carbon Britain would look like. How would it be if we changed our energy resources to completely renewable? How would it be if we cut down on the amount of meat consumption? What would Britain look like? And when you look at it, you see that it's a vibrant, thriving, prosperous Britain that we would have under those circumstances. We would have to moderate our lifestyles in some ways, but we will still have a high level of living that we've been, not quite what we've been used to, but very close to it. It requires immediate action from a number of different players. The first thing is it requires immediate action from governments, and those governments aren't just national governments, they're international governments, but perhaps more importantly, they're city governments and regional and district governments as well. Everybody has got a role here to shift the policy agenda and provide a framework within which the rest of us, can work. Large corporations and wider businesses will also be required to act. You could argue that they should be acting on their own, but they will want government guidance and regulation to provide a framework within which to act. And the other thing it's going to require is action from individuals. But if you think about what that action is, that action really is to press governments and corporations for action. And it's also to welcome those actions, because some of them are going to be seen as quite negative, going to require us to reduce our car dependence, for example. And we need to welcome those actions when they come, because we understand where they're coming from. There is a small role for individual actions, things like, well, for example, I've decided I'm not going to fly anymore. I eat a plant-based diet, and I'm sitting here with 3 levels of fleece on because I haven't got my heating on, partly to save fuel bills and partly to save energy. There is a place for those actions. But those actions, we shouldn't pretend that we are going to solve this problem by multiplying individual actions. We're going to solve this problem by persuading governments and corporations to act. And our individual actions are a sign, a symbol of the passion we're putting into that and the importance that we feel that needs to go into it. And they're also indicative that we will welcome those actions when governments and corporations insist on them. So in summary of this little section, climate change is here now. It will get worse. That's just going to happen. It is caused by humans, but the good news of it being caused by humans is that we can act to limit its effects, but only if we act now. So that's the end of the sciencey bit. I was just going to pause now in case there are any matters of clarification that anyone would like to bring up. I don't particularly want to get into a discussion now. But I'll just pause. If you want to, if there's anything you'd like clarifying, put it in the chat. And not seeing very much.
No, I haven't seen anything either.
Okay, so I'll knock on. So let's just remind ourselves of the original question. What does progressive Christianity have to say about climate change? We've looked at attitudes to truth and the fact that we want to accept what the science is telling us. The first concept I want to look at is one of stewardship. So if you ask almost anybody within the church, what is the primary response to climate change and the environmental challenge, they'll tell us we need to be good stewards of our planet. But as progressive Christians, let's think about that. Stewardship is the theory that a creator God delegates responsibility for his creation to humans, to us. Now, if we don't believe in a creator God in the way that it's envisaged in the Bible as an individual, mindful person that's individual for every creative act, then how do we develop this idea of stewardship? What if we don't believe in a mindful creator? What if there isn't a mindful creator that's able to delegate responsibility? What does stewardship actually mean when we think about the sort of God that most of us as progressive Christians believe in? Oops, I'll just go back to that. And I think there are two approaches here. One of them to say is that this is essentially a metaphorical description of how things are, that stewardship is descriptive metaphorically descriptive rather than prescriptive. It's not how they should be, it's just an observation of how they are. And I think there is an argument that if you look around us, we do have dominion over the natural world, whether it's been something that's been given to God or that's something we just seized for ourselves. But the need to treat that, to take that seriously and to have stewardship is quite reasonable. But the other approach as progressive Christians is we can actually go back and look at what the Bible says. Because if we take away that first chapter of Genesis, there is very little in the Bible that suggests that God assumes that humans are going to take care of it for him. If you look at most of the statements in the Bible about God's relationship to nature, they're basically summarized by this, the first verse of Psalm 24, the earth is the Lord's and all that's in it. Very little reference anywhere else other than the book of Genesis to the idea that mankind should be looking after God on God's behalf. And I think if you look at the Bible as a whole, the predominant idea that comes through it is that we should have reverence for the natural world, rather than that we should be having stewardship over it. And I think one of the things that the stewardship theory leads on to is the idea that nature is a commodity, that we can choose to do what we want with, even though we might be enlightened in what we're doing. We've got a local issue here at the moment with a beautiful stand of trees that the council is wanting to demolish because they are inconvenient for what it wants to do. And you've got that idea of stewardship, the idea that this is a commodity that we can manage for our own benefit, rather than a treasure to be cherished. And I would much rather have us looking at nature as this treasure that's to be cherished, rather than a community to be managed. And of course, one of the things we see with the ways of dealing with the environment within a market economy is the idea that everything gets its price. We put a price on a kilometre of rainforest in the Amazon, and if someone is prepared to pay the price, we let them destroy it. We should be saying this is a sacred treasure that we should cherish rather than turn into a commodity. The next theme I want to just explore is justice and love for neighbour, which these two themes which I think dance together through the Bible. It's a tendency to think that justice is an Old Testament concept and love for your neighbour is a New Testament concept. But if you remember, that phrase about loving our neighbour is based in passages in Deuteronomy and Leviticus. Throughout the Bible, these two concepts go together. And a statistic that seems to be flying around all over the place at the moment is that over 2,500 verses in the Bible are about justice. And there are some really big justice issues in relation to climate change. So the first one is that climate change is already affecting the weakest and most vulnerable in the planet. It's partly chance that the weakest and most vulnerable are living in the regions that are most affected by climate change, but it's also a consequence of economic development itself. Once you've got a certain level of economic development, you are protected to a lot of the changes that climate change is bringing about. So climate change is affecting the weakest and most vulnerable and is going to continue to affect the weakest and most vulnerable. It's also, generally speaking, affecting those who have done the least to cause it. If you, haven't got time to show it in any detail, but if you can look at maps of where carbon dioxide has been generated historically and the places that are most affected by climate change at the moment, and they are completely different. The places that are being affected by climate change at the moment are those who have done least to generate carbon dioxide historically. And the final justice issue we've got is future generations. At the moment, my children and my grandchildren are going to pay for the profligacy of myself and people of our generation. So there are real justice issues about climate change. And I just point you to point 8 of our points. We need to work together within and beyond the church to achieve a just, peaceful and sustainable world. And I just root you to those 2 words, just, unsustainable. And I think peaceful comes into it as well, because unless we resolve these issues equitably and justly, we're going to end up with war situations as people struggle to survive. Moving on fairly quickly, another thing that I think we need to think about is how we think about sin. So for over 2,000 years, the church is obsessed about personal sinfulness. If you remember, the Reformation was all about the extremes of the Catholic Church wanting to sell forgiveness for sins through indulgences, and Martin Luther's horror at that. But of course, what it was replaced by was the Protestant view of sin, that we are all sinners and that we need to repent, as the church teaches us to repent, in order to find our salvation. I'm not sure that's how Jesus saw it. If you read the stories of Jesus, Jesus actually doesn't seem too bothered by individual sin. He's quite often forgiving sin. And if you've got a high version of Christianity, you'll tend to think, well, that's because he was so powerful. I myself suspect it's because he didn't see it as that important. What Jesus saw as particularly important within society was structural sinfulness within the society within which he was living, and particularly the structural sinfulness within the religious structures of the time in first century Judaism. He was actually excoriating about the scribes and the Pharisees and the rich people in charge of the domination system that was occurring in Palestine at the time. Jesus's teaching is much more critical of structural sinfulness than it is about individual sinfulness. And I think when we come to the climate emergency, we've got to bring that focus to our thinking. Yes, as individuals, we're all participants in what's happening to our climate, but the thing that's really driving it is the structural sinfulness that's inherent within our society at the moment. It's the profit motive that's driving fossil fuel companies to extract more and more fuels. It's the economic systems that are causing our environment to be destroyed. And what we need to focus on much more as a religious organization is not individual sinfulness, it's about the structural sinfulness that's inherent in our society. And I hope that that's one of the things that the progressive movement can contribute to the debate within Christianity. And number 3 of our 8 points, we recognize that following Jesus leads us to act with compassion and to confront evil. And I would see this structural sinfulness that we have in our society as the primary evil that we need to confront at the moment. Few quick words about salvation. Mainstream church seems to assume that salvation is for selected individuals. Oops, where's he gone? It's going to happen somewhere else, in heaven perhaps. And it's going to happen in the future. And if you have a view of salvation like this, then actually it's only a secondary concern what happens on this planet. I have heard people on the more conservative side of the church saying we don't need to worry about the environment, either because we're all going to end up in heaven where it's going to be perfect, or because God is going to bring about a renewal of everything and restore everything to how it was at the start. And under those circumstances, actually, maybe it doesn't matter what's going to happen to the planet. But I think a more progressive view is to see salvation as something that's for us all. Oh dear, wrong buttons. That is something about what happens here, and there's something about what happens now. And if we can see salvation in those terms, then we can see that our salvation is inextricably linked with the future of the environment in which we're living and experiencing that salvation. I want to finish with a few words about hope, because one of the other interesting things, if we go back to Genesis, is do we as progressive Christians believe in the promise of the rainbow? Remember when God stretched that rainbow in the sky, he said that he would never allow us to be destroyed. There are portions of the church that think we don't have to worry about the environment because we've got that promise. There are parts of the mainstream church that believe that God has got a plan, that somehow, though we can't understand it, what we're going through at the moment, it must be part of God's plan for how things should be. I don't have that faith. I don't believe in that promise. I think we've got to look after the planet and the world we're in to ensure that it continues and that it flourishes. So I think we need to engage with lament. If we move away from the idea that our hope is automatic, that God will come to the rescue, then we have to admit the emotional burden that that imposes upon us. And you can look through large tracts of the Old Testament and find verses like this that are showing us that the early Jews in particular really understood what it was to lament for a world that's not as it's supposed to be, or is not as it could be. This is a selection from Isaiah, but there are numerous psalms of lament as well, and there are other passages throughout the Old Testament. It's interesting to note that there are more psalms of lament in the Old Testament than there are psalms of praise. The Jews related to their God through frustration that the world wasn't as it should be, more than they related to God through praise for what he'd done for them. And I think this is something that we as Christians as a whole have got to recapture, the idea that we've got to accept that there are parts of the world that are not as God requires or God wants. So I would say that lament brings a recognition that the world is not as it could be. Some Christians will say it's not as God wants, or perhaps not as it should be. But I'll just limit it to lament is a recognition that the world is not as it could be. But the prophetic imagination reveals how it can be. And of course, that's, I think, one of the most important books I've ever read was Walter Brueggemann's The Prophetic Imagination, which goes from lament, recognition of why the world is, to a prophetic imagination about how the world can be. And our hope lies in that vision and an assumption that we can, if we take it seriously, realize that vision. And I'm particularly proud of the Methodist Church who provided this report several years ago now, Hoping God's Future. And I've pinched this phrase from the conclusions. Hope is thus a reason for bold action in the world, not an excuse for inaction. I've grayed out the bits that perhaps some of us from a progressive angle will find a little bit more difficult to take in. Hope is thus a reason for bold action in the world, not an excuse for inaction. So if I'm asked where my hope comes from, my hope comes that if we engage with the problems, we as wider humanity can come through them. Final word about the large blue butterfly. The large blue butterfly was extinct in Britain by by 1979. It was extinct because it's dependent on short cropped pasture land, unimproved pasture land, and farmers had chosen to improve that pasture land, and it was no longer available for the butterflies. A number of scientific studies went into exactly what the characteristics of that pasture land have to be in order for the large blue butterfly to survive. And as a consequence, the several nature reserves and several farmers started adopting practices that were specifically set up in order to bring about a habitat in which the butterfly could survive. In the late 1980s, the butterfly started coming back, and there are now 33 different sites throughout Britain where that butterfly is flourishing, and there are more large blue butterflies in Britain than there are anywhere else in Europe at the moment. And I think the take-home message for that in terms of hope are that if we listen to what the scientists are telling us, and if we take action, then we can make change that brings about resurrection. And I just point out that the butterfly from a long time ago has been a Christian symbol of resurrection, the insect that has to die in order to start living and showing us its beauty again. So I'm going to stop there and hope that you'll be able to reflect on some of the things I've said in breakout groups. I'd like you to think about that question I've been posing. What does progressive Christianity have to say about the climate emergency? And I'd particularly like to focus on what it has to say that's different from mainstream Christianity. And what we'd like you to do is, in each of your groups, we'd like you to think of one area where this is true, that you could bring back from the group into a discussion in a plenary session later.
I'll just say very quickly then, you don't have to all answer if you enjoyed your discussion, you haven't come out with a comment, the kind of comment that Richard said or comment that you've made yourself, I'll just quickly go through the breakout rooms and see what people want to contribute, or a piece of that they can contribute, but they don't have to. Don't feel forced. This is not arms twisting time. So breakout room 1, is there anybody?
Yes, I will say something.
Lovely.
You're breaking up.
We are agreed that that we cannot just sit back and think it's nothing to do with us and we can't do anything. We must, you know, differently, because we're in different situations. We must support what is going on. Both in, we must do things in our individual lives, but we also must put what pressure we can on those in power.
Thank you very much. Breakout room 2, is there anybody there?
So, I was in breakout room 2, and we
Thank
were
you.
more or less said the same thing, that we thought we all ought to be doing our individually what we could, but it was also the thing that Richard said about structural sinfulness and the whole way our world is governing itself, and that we need to be you know, lobbying MPs and things like that as well, and
Thank
working with 8 different age groups of people, because all of us here are above a certain age, and we need to be trying to link up with younger people as well.
Thank you very much. So anybody from breakout room 3?
Yes, we would agree with the comment from group 2 that we talked about the way the world operates. We talked about the way the world operates, the economic systems, the power systems. That those are what need to be tackled in order to change the conversation. The big question is how do we do that? How do we do that successfully? From an when you turn from individual point of view, a lot of the way our own society is organized, the focus is very much on self. The dialogue needs to be changed, not from self, but to community, and community in the very widest sense of that. But how do we actually do that? Christine did ask me to make one particular comment that we chatted about in discussion. I mentioned that I'd seen read a piece recently about Native American Indians, that when they make key decision makings, they don't just think about this generation or the next one. They actually think about 7 generations' time, the impact on 7 generations. And that's the kind of massive change of thinking that needs to happen for the dialogue to change.
Thank you. Also, is there somebody from breakout room 4?
We had a very good discussion, Martin. I'm just looking at the question to everyone now, that last question in the chat room, because towards the end of our discussion, we started talking about how passionate we should be and how we relate to people who are taking direct action, throwing soup at sunflowers and so on. And I wonder, Mike, I mean, Mike had a marvelous kind of ending to it. Mike, are you there?
Yeah.
Okay, I just feel that we haven't moved forward much in 2,000 years, and our role should be to annoy our religious leaders by challenging them about the very sorts of things that Jesus annoyed his religious leaders with. And I just said Jesus went to all the best parties with all the wrong people, which was one of the many things that got under the skin, I think, of the religious elite.
Thank you very much.
I think we should be active. So.
Breakout room 5.
Hi, we tended to think that our church leaders are appallingly silent about this. They seem to think their job is to save souls rather than save the planet. And So we're not. Maybe we should be more of a ginger group within our own churches to exert pressure on them. We suppose the church hasn't got the influence in society that it used to, after all, does it?
Thank you, Peter. And lastly, 6, and then we'll hand back to Richard.
Yes, I don't have a very good memory for these things. I mean, I think we actually thought that we did have a duty to speak out and to try and change the attitudes of the church, which is a body which is everywhere, although not always regarded, but it is actually everywhere and ought to be doing far more. I think there were a number of other points that came out, but I don't know if I jotted them down. The system seemed to be wrong, and I think our theology is wrong, which is not our theology, but theology in general, as promoted by the churches, is wrong, and therefore leads into a very narrow view of how we don't bother to react, or we react in a very inadequate way, and that if we actually started looking at the sort of more underlying factors without worrying too much about the exact nature of God to start off with, then we might actually get somewhere.
Thank you, John. Can I hand back to Richard now, please, so he can bring the session to a close?
Yeah, really interesting points. Difficult to know how to move forward. It's a question of priorities, isn't it? In a lot of ways, there's so much that we could be doing. We could be. I think I like what the last group was saying about the idea that our theology is wrong. The question is, have we got time to change it? There is an emergence. There is an immediacy about the climate emergency that means, you know, we've really got to make changes within the next decade. And you know, there's whether we should be spending a lot of time trying to influence the theology, or whether we should be trying to work alongside and other people and try and move more quickly, I think is something we need to bear in mind. I think the one of the parables that's important for me is the parable of the yeast in the loaf, or the salt in the meal. That small groups of people embedded within larger groups can be really effective, and I think one of the things we can do is we can see ourselves in that sort of pattern. I think the days are gone, certainly in Britain, when we thought of Christendom as something that was going to envelop the world. What we need to go back is to that the parable of the yeast and the mustard seed, and see ourselves as small numbers of people who, if we work within our organizations, can work effectively. I think we do need to challenge our religious leaders. Some of them are speaking out. I mean, the Pope in particular has been a great advocate for bringing the climate emergency to the forefront of the world, and also for highlighting the justice issues that are associated with it. The Archbishop of Canterbury's been less good, but he's still been there. But an awful lot of our middle level leaders don't seem to be saying a great deal about these issues, and I think it'd be good to hear them. And I really love that idea about thinking about the 7th-generation impact of any ideas that we've got. I think Scotland have changed their legislation, haven't they? I think they have to think about just future generations whenever any legislation becomes before their parliament nowadays. It'd be great if they had to think about the next 7 generations rather than that. Having said that, one group was talking about working with different ages, and I think working with different ages is important, but I also think we've got to acknowledge the particular guilt of our own generation. Within our lifestyle, within our lifetimes, about 75% of the additional carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere has been released. It's been our generation that have caused this problem in many ways, and I think we need to shoulder some of the burden for trying to work our way out of that. I'm just going to chat about 2 messages that got their way into the chat. One of them has been there for quite a long time, from Jackie, about the relationship to the present energy crisis. I think the present energy crisis and the climate emergency are in many ways quite different. The present energy crisis is really an economic crisis caused by short-term drivers, including the war in Ukraine at the moment, whereas the climate emergency is a much bigger, longer term issue. But where they do overlap is there will be considerable numbers of people who are trying to save energy at the moment to save money. And if we can persuade them not only to do it to save money, but to save the planet in the longer term, I think we can piggyback the two together, and I hope we can make progress. I think there's a lot more acceptance of talking about ways of insulating our houses and reducing our heating bills. So I certainly think we could use that strategically, but I do think we need to bear in mind that they're quite different issues in the longer term. The other one, which I think Simon's put in mainly to keep us going, if anything else dried up, was the question about what do we do as a church? Should we be taking specific pieces of action, or should we be trying to change the way people think about things like structural sin? I think when we take action, we need to remind ourselves that, to my mind, all the action we're taking is building up a demand for greater change at higher levels. And so we should be doing it. We should be thinking about divestment. We should be thinking about insulating our buildings, but we should be doing it in order that we can spread the message that we really need to take corporate action at as many different levels as possible. And I certainly think issues like thinking about structural sin, these are the things we can be tackling in our worship, in our preaching, in our small group discussions. So I think we certainly can be looking at issues like that. It's a question to somebody about the controversial tactics used by climate change protesters. I think we'll all have our own personal opinions on that. I was quite active within Extinction Rebellion at one time. I've dropped my activity from them recently, although it's an incremental decision rather than a kind of on-off thing. I think maybe 2 or 3 years ago that radical groups like Extinction Rebellion really did something quite remarkable by bringing the issues to the fore in the public debate. I don't think those groups are having nearly the same effect. There's been quite a lot of Extinction Rebellion activity over the last few months, and it just hasn't been reported in newspapers. So it's a pragmatic issue more than anything else, in that we don't seem to be generating the publicity. I wonder if there are issues with the BBC wanting to renew its charter before too long, and whether it's got some implicit censorship that it's putting on itself to present protest movements being properly publicised. But it's quite difficult to explain why so much activity has been going on and so little of it has been going on to the BBC in particular. I think but I do think there's a role for radical protest, if only to keep the issues in the agenda. Personally, I think we need to be more targeted. I think the idea of those protests that seem to indiscriminately inconvenience the general public are problematic. On the other hand, they can be used as a parable. People who complain about the M25 being closed down for 2 hours need to think about what's happening in Somalia at the moment. If they want to think about inconvenience, they need to think about what does it mean if you've got to leave your inherited farming lands and move off into refugee camps. That is inconvenience. And when we hear these protests, we've got to think, actually being held up in your car for 2 hours is not inconvenience, as many people in the world are experiencing at the moment. So I think we can use these opportunities, but I think there is going to be a continuing debate about how effective they are. I think I'm going to get a bit incoherent if I try and address all these issues in there. I think I might just stop there and thank you all for listening and hand you back to Martin. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your excellent presentations, Richard. And I think we're all particularly pleased about the theological input, as well as the quick run through climate change. I'd like to give us a vote of thanks, or give you a vote of thanks for giving up your time. And for the people here, next session is next Wednesday, and it's completely different to Richard because it's medical from Ian Cook, Professor Ian Cook, and he will be looking at that. And just a little plea from from us all as one of the trustees. If you're not a member of PCN and you've enjoyed tonight, please join us, because as people said, the more of us there are, the bigger the group, the more noise we can make. And so thank you all very much. And I hope to see you all at 7:30 next week with Ian Cook and the questions of medical ethics. And thank you again, Richard, very much for kicking off this session really well.